Hey everyone, just want to let you all know that this is technically a re-upload. The original video I posted got a couple copyright strikes, so I had to go back and change some things. So if you notice any inconsistencies with what's happened on WWE television, just please keep in mind that this was written and posted before some of those things that happened on television. But please feel free to give me any feedback and constructive criticism on how to improve, as I'm very new at this and I want to get better. That all being said, please sit back and enjoy. Thank you! Ever since around 2015, Bayley and Sasha Banks have been intertwined with one another on WWE television, from feuding on NXT to being a babyface team on Raw, a heel team on SmackDown, and even more recently when they were across all three brands, holding every single major title available to them. That's not to say that every moment these two have had has been great. The therapy segments come to mind, but when you look at their overall work together, I think there's a lot more good than bad. Examples being their NXT TakeOver Brooklyn match, the Iron Woman match. They had an NXT TakeOver Respect in which they became the first women to ever main event a TakeOver. Bayley's first appearance on the main roster was as a surprise partner for Sasha, and then becoming the first ever women to win the WWE Women's Tag Team Championships. With all these years invested in these two in this program, fans weren't asking if the two are ever going to be paired up against each other again, but more so rather, when are they going to be facing each other again? And as of the September 4th edition of SmackDown, we are finally taking steps in that direction when Bayley turned on Sasha. That being said, though, we still quite don't know yet when they are going to have their inevitable match together. SummerSlam would have been a very fitting place, considering that it would have been around the 5-year anniversary when they had their TakeOver match, but that SummerSlam already passed, and they were still aligned with each other and feuding with Asuka, so that didn't happen. It didn't happen at Clash of Champions either, as Bayley was set to defend the title against Nikki Cross, who had to be replaced at the last minute with Asuka. Based off current rumors and speculation, it seems like the match might take place at the Hell in a Cell pay-per-view inside the Hell in a Cell. And while the concept on paper sounds nice, this big dramatic story meeting its conclusion inside the cell, I don't think that's the right place to have the match. At least the event, that is. The reason being is pay-per-views like Clash of Champions, like Hell in a Cell, like Payback, like TLC, are filler. They exist in the modern day so that way WWE can say, hey, we have these monthly pay-per-views, now go subscribe to our network. And that's really the role that pay-per-views like Clash of Champions, like Hell in a Cell play. Filler. So while they are pay-per-views and thus bigger shows, those aren't the shows that I think this 5-year story should meet its conclusion at. So what other shows do you have left? Well, you have the big 4 pay-per-views: SummerSlam, Survivor Series, Royal Rumble, and WrestleMania. And I say that those are the big 4 because those 4 pay-per-views are the pay-per-views that never get changed. Everything else in the calendar year gets swapped or replaced with something else. But for about the past 30 years, those pay-per-views have always been around. So I think if you're going to have this match happen, it should happen at one of those shows because of the history that those shows have. It's already instilled in the fans' mind that because these are the shows that are always guaranteed every year and they're never swapped out like the other ones, these are the big 4 shows that are the most important. Like I said, SummerSlam just passed, so that's not going to happen. Well, in terms of the big 4, after SummerSlam, you have Survivor Series. And yes, Survivor Series is a very big show, but I don't necessarily think the Bayley and Sasha Banks match should happen there either, because for the past couple years, Survivor Series has had the theme of brand versus brand, Raw versus SmackDown, Raw versus SmackDown versus NXT. And it wouldn't make too much sense given that Bayley and Sasha are on the same brand. But let's say that you send Sasha to Raw and she wins the Raw Women's title again, and you do the Bayley versus Sasha Banks at Survivor Series like that. Well, while I don't think the brand warfare would overshadow Bayley and Sasha, I do think it would overcomplicate it because it's adding an extra layer to the story that really doesn't need to be there. The story should be about Bayley and Sasha, the culmination of this big 5-year program. It shouldn't be about, oh, Raw versus SmackDown or Raw versus SmackDown versus NXT. I think when this match happens, it shouldn't be at a show like Survivor Series because that show is going to be about brands versus brands, and I think that would just, and it wouldn't overshadow Bayley versus Sasha, but it would just add another layer that doesn't need to be there. The big match that they have should just be about them facing each other. It shouldn't be about, oh, which one is better, Raw versus SmackDown. No, it should be about Bayley versus Sasha and who's going to come out on top. It shouldn't be about Raw versus SmackDown. And it wouldn't even be guaranteed to be one-on-one. It might be a triple threat if you include NXT, which some might argue, well, that would be better because you're giving the fans a taste of it and they're going to want it even more. And while I do get that argument, this story has been going on since 2015. And when these two finally have a match against each other in some way, shape, or form, I think it should be one-on-one. I think if you have it in a triple threat, it would have made more sense if they're still aligned with one another. In that sense, then you're teasing it. But now that the turns finally happened, in storyline, these two should hate each other and want to go after each other. And if you just add another person in there, I just feel like that's a tad bit unnecessary because that, again, with the Raw versus SmackDown stuff, it just adds another layer that doesn't need to be there. So Survivor Series is probably out of the picture. So what other big major shows do you have after that? Well, after Survivor Series is the Royal Rumble. And yes, while the Royal Rumble is a big show, unlike Survivor Series, where the theme of the pay-per-view I don't think would overshadow Bayley versus Sasha, I do think the Royal Rumble pay-per-view, the theme of that show, would, because people watch the Royal Rumble every year for the Royal Rumble matches. Everything else on the card after that is just an extra piece of the card. And in my opinion, Bayley versus Sasha Banks shouldn't feel like an extra piece of the card. It should be one of the main focused matches on whatever show it's going to be on. And I just feel like a Royal Rumble wouldn't be the right place to have it, especially because the Royal Rumble pay-per-view is a show that's designed to lead up to the next big major pay-per-view, which coincidentally is where I think this match should take place. I think the Bayley versus Sasha Banks match should take place at WrestleMania. And more specifically, I think it should take place in the main event of WrestleMania for the SmackDown Women's title. And especially if it's a two-night WrestleMania like it was this year, I think you could have Bayley and Sasha headline one of those nights. And if it is just a normal WrestleMania next year in which it's just a one-night show, I believe that Bayley versus Sasha Banks should main event WrestleMania. Before I make my case as to why I think these two should main event WrestleMania next year, I want to touch on why I think it's necessary that it's for the SmackDown Women's title and not for the Raw Women's title or non-title. I think it's very crucial that this match that they inevitably have, if it does take place in the main event of WrestleMania, should be for the SmackDown Women's title. I'm not going to say that if it doesn't have the belt, the match is ruined, because I don't think it would be. But I think that having the title there adds a lot more to the story. And as good as it is on its own, it's just that much more better with the SmackDown Women's title being included. So first things first, I think it's an interesting thing with the Bayley turn, in which we're now back to where we started with this story 5 years ago, but we're not. It's almost like a 360 degree, but not really, more so an 80 degree change, because when these two started their program, Sasha was the heel champion and Bayley was the babyface challenger. Now, given the turn, the roles are reversed because Bayley is the heel champion and Sasha would be the babyface challenger. So it's this interesting dynamic where we're back to where we started, but not really, because the roles are reversed. Second, and I think this is the more important part, Bayley's character, ever since May of 2019, has been about holding that belt and keeping that belt by any means necessary. Aside from a 5-day period in September of 2019, she has always had that belt. And even within that 5-day period, she lost it and immediately won it back just a couple of days later. Everything that this character has done ever since 2019, May of 2019, has been keeping that SmackDown Women's title for her and doing whatever it takes to keep that title. I think it'd be very fitting if by the end of it, you have the Bayley and Sasha match, Sasha wins. And that's an extra layer to the story too, is that the SmackDown Women's title is the one title that Sasha hasn't held on the main roster. So I think that's an extra layer to the story that you could add there. It's not a big one, but it's still something there that you could touch on. But I do think it would be very fitting if by the end of it, you have Sasha beating Bayley for the SmackDown Women's title. Again, I don't think it's 100% essential that there has to be for the title, but I do think having the title there and be involved in that way adds a lot more to the story than it would if it was just gone. Like if they do something where Sasha costs Bayley the title, that's something that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I do think it's very important that the SmackDown Women's title is involved. If it's not, it doesn't ruin the story, but I do feel like it adds a lot. Let's take this moment to address some of the issues that some people might have with the Bayley and Sasha Banks headlining a WrestleMania. The first couple of issues that I could see some people having are, oh, well, I can't buy into the women main eventing WrestleMania, or I can't buy into these characters being credible enough to be in that position, or I just don't feel like this story is a WrestleMania worthy story, or I don't think these two can have a WrestleMania worthy main event match. All of which are concerns that could see some people having. But in my opinion, when you look at the quality and the context of this story and the competitors involved, I do think that Bayley and Sasha Banks do fit the criteria for every single one of those things in terms of why their story and their match, if it happens at WrestleMania, should be the main event of that show. And here's why. I want to address this issue first because I think it's the smallest issue, but it's something that I can still see some people having reservations about, which is, oh, well, I can't buy into the women main eventing WrestleMania. Tough luck, they already did! Another thing I want to talk about is the argument that, well, some people just can't buy them as credible WrestleMania main event worthy competitors. But I don't think that's valid either, because when you look at every major accomplishment a women's wrestler can achieve in WWE, Bayley and Sasha have done them all. Let's look at Bayley's side first. NXT Women's Champion, 2-time SmackDown Women's Champion, longest reigning SmackDown Women's Champion, Raw Women's Champion, 2-time WWE Women's Tag Team Champion, first ever WWE Women's Tag Team Champion, Money in the Bank winner. Now let's look at Sasha's side. Former NXT Women's Champion, 5-time Raw Women's Champion. I think, if anything, that's a record for most Raw Women's title reigns. And again, two-time with Bayley, 2-time WWE Women's Tag Team Champion, first ever WWE Women's Tag Team Champion with Bayley. The only major accomplishment they haven't achieved between the two of them is a Royal Rumble win, which maybe that's how you could set up the WrestleMania match. Maybe you could have Sasha win the Royal Rumble, and then you could say, hey, these two women facing each other in the main event of WrestleMania have achieved every major accomplishment a women's wrestler can achieve in WWE. Because if you have Sasha win the Rumble, between the two of them, they really would have done every major accomplishment you have from a storyline standpoint. And that's not including all the amazing matches and all the main event matches that they've had. So for someone to say, well, I can't buy into these characters from a storyline standpoint being credible enough to be in the WrestleMania main event, then I have to ask from a storyline standpoint, what can you buy into them? Because Bayley and Sasha would have accomplished everything they can in that division. Before I compare the other possible big WrestleMania matches for next year, I want to make it clear that these examples I'm about to give are what I think are possibly the biggest WrestleMania matches for next year, but not necessarily the matches I think should take place next year. I'm looking at this in terms of, okay, who's on the active roster right now and what stories are going on that are the biggest possible matches to do on that show next year. Again, I'm not saying these are the matches that I think should happen, but I'm just saying in terms of name value and ongoing stories, these are the matches that I think are the biggest that you could have next year. So first, let's look at the Raw side. Let's say that Randy Orton beats Drew McIntyre for the WWE Championship and he carries it until WrestleMania, and he defends it against Edge, the person he's been currently feuding with in this on and off kind of story, but for the most part, he's been in this program targeting Edge since around January of 2019. And the idea is that Edge is going to come back and he's going to get revenge on Randy Orton for taking him out, and he takes the title from him at WrestleMania. Let's say that's the possible big Raw World title match for WrestleMania next year. I could see someone making the argument that, oh, that would be a bigger match than the Bayley and Sasha story because Edge and Randy Orton started feuding in 2004. But that's not really the same thing, because while they did start feuding in 2004, they haven't been consistently feuding or in this program since 2004. The Bayley and Sasha program has been going on since 2015, and it's been going on since 2015. The Edge and Randy Orton story started in 2004, but it hasn't been going on since 2004. They feuded in 2004, the feud ended, they didn't interact again until they became a tag team 2 years later, and then they lasted for about 6-8 months, and that team ended, and then they didn't have any interactions for about 2 to 3 years. Then they had a feud in 2010 that just randomly ended with no real conclusion. Then they had a random tag team match together in 2011. Edge retired later that year, and he came back recently in 2020, and he's been feuding with Randy Orton ever since. And that's another point I want to touch on when I finish this one, but I think people have had their fill of Randy Orton Edge matches. But before I talk about that, the point I'm trying to get at right now is I don't think it's fair to compare Randy Orton and Edge and Bayley versus Sasha in terms of their stories on length, because Edge and Randy Orton started in 2004, but it hasn't been going on since 2004. Bayley and Sasha started feuding in 2015, and their story's been going on since 2015. So even in terms of length, Edge and Randy Orton wouldn't have that over Sasha and Bayley. And something else I want to touch on, and this is going back towards the Randy Orton Edge matches, Bayley and Sasha having their match at the main event of WrestleMania 37 would be the climax of their story. Edge and Randy Orton already had the climax to their feud at WrestleMania 36. Every single one of Edge's matches since he came back have had Randy Orton involved. And I'm not even saying that's a bad thing. As a matter of fact, I even liked the WrestleMania 36 match. A match that a lot of fans made it clear that they didn't like, and that's perfectly fine. The reason why I bring up that I like the match is because I'm trying to say that this isn't coming from a place of, oh, I didn't like it. But what I am trying to say, though, is that it's redundant to do this match again. And I don't even think it would be bad, but the climax for the story has already happened. So what if you throw the title in there? We've already seen Edge get his revenge on Randy Orton at WrestleMania and prove that he still has it. And I'm not even saying that you shouldn't continue the feud if you don't want to, but that's the biggest possible match you can do at WrestleMania next year on the Raw side. And I don't think that should mean event over Bayley and Sasha, especially because the story would be the same. At WrestleMania 36, the match was Edge versus Randy Orton, with Edge getting his revenge on Randy for taking him out. And then next year, it would be the same thing. Edge comes back to get his revenge on Randy Orton for taking him out. Only difference is that the title's on the line this time. But it's the same story, and we've already seen it. And again, that's fine. I'm sure the match would be fine. I'm sure they would make the story fine. Edge and Randy, that is. But the point I'm trying to get at here is that's the biggest possible match you could do on the Raw side for the world title. And I don't see that being as big as Bayley versus Sasha. And I know I'm beating a dead horse here, but the reason is because we've already seen the climax for Edge versus Randy. Bayley and Sasha would be having their climax at WrestleMania if they have the match that year. Edge and Randy wouldn't because we've already seen it. Let's look on the male side of SmackDown in terms of which match can main event WrestleMania next year. Currently, Roman Reigns is the Universal Champion, and I think he will and should hold that title until WrestleMania next year. I think based off current stories being told and the biggest possible opponent on the active roster, his opponent will be Bray Wyatt. I think there's potential for the match to be great and for them to tell a great story. But I think Bayley and Sasha Banks have them beat in both of those categories. Let's look at the story aspect. More specifically, the big dramatic turns both of these stories have. Let me preface this by saying I think the Bray Wyatt-Roman Reigns storyline heading into WrestleMania can be great. And I can see the seeds being planted for it. But I think the most dramatic and memorable moment has already happened, which is the Roman Reigns heel turn. Because that was something fans were asking for and never thought they would see. And in all honesty, I think it was great and I thought it was really well done, and there was hardly anything he could have done to make it better. And because it was so unexpected, it was just a shocking moment. And I just can't see anything else topping that. Now, I'm not saying that whatever they do going forward is going to be bad or that it's just going to be downhill from here. If anything, I think they could still create some great moments and memorable moments. I just don't think it's going to be able to top that. And seeing as how the heel turn would be the high point for a potential Bray Wyatt-Roman Reigns program heading into WrestleMania next year, I think it's fair to compare that to the high point of Bayley and Sasha Banks. Which, in my opinion, for that program, the high point was when Bayley turned on Sasha Banks. And when looking at both of these turns, there are some similarities. For Roman Reigns, his character is turning on the fans, thus turning heel, and he's doing it over a championship. Bayley turned on Sasha Banks. Sasha Banks, through the match beforehand, was wrestling, from a storyline standpoint, of course, but was wrestling with an injured knee and didn't give up and kept going, which is a very babyface thing to do. Thus, when Bayley turned on Sasha Banks, it effectively solidified the Sasha Banks babyface turn that was being established the match beforehand, or at least was hinted at the match beforehand. But also the idea with Bayley turning on Sasha Banks was for Sasha Banks to never challenge her for the belt. So again, it's another situation where there's a turn happening over a championship. So that being said, some similarities and differences with the Roman Reigns heel turn and Sasha being turned on by Bayley. But now let's look at the actual context of what happened during those turns. Roman Reigns, who after being off of TV for a long period of time, for a very justifiable reason, came back, kicked Bray Wyatt in the dick, and won the Universal Championship away from him. Bayley, who in the span of a week, her and Sasha Banks lost almost everything that they had. And when they couldn't win it all back, out of anger, but also as a defense mechanism to keep the last thing that she had, she broke Sasha's neck. Again, let's look at this one more time from a surface level. One guy kicked a clown in the dick for his blueberry belt. One woman broke her best friend's neck. I think one of these angles is a little bit more serious than the other. While I do think there's potential for a great match to come out of Roman Reigns and Bray Wyatt, I am hesitant to say that it's very likely, and that a Bayley and Sasha Banks match would actually be a safer bet to headline the show in terms of match quality. And I'm not saying that because I think Roman Reigns is a bad wrestler or Bray Wyatt is a bad wrestler. I think they're both great. But when analyzing the situation, I think the potential for the match to be a dud outweighs the potential for the match to be great. I say that because let's look at all the Roman Reigns WrestleMania main event matches. He had 4 WrestleMania main events in a row, 3 of which were heavily criticized. And based off the reactions from those crowds those nights, I think they would agree that they weren't really pleased with those matches, and if anything, were very disappointing. Now, that's not all on Roman Reigns. He did have one great WrestleMania match with Brock Lesnar, but that might have been the exception that proves the rule, because they did the WrestleMania match again 3 years later, and it was not well received. Fans were so bored during that match they started throwing beach balls to entertain themselves. And the poorly received WrestleMania main event matches aren't all Roman Reigns' fault. But when your WrestleMania main events are more so associated with being duds than constantly well-received performances, I think there would be a hesitation to put that person back in that spot. Plus, he's had 4 WrestleMania main event matches in a row. I think there needs to be more variety of people in that spot. Now let's look at Bray Wyatt. He's had some really good performances, but a lot of those performances came when he was a different character. The style he wrestles now is different because it needs to fit the character. But based off fan reception, it hasn't really worked. Because when analyzing all of his matches since he's turned into that character, fans are often left disappointing. The first match he had with Finn Balor was fine. It wasn't great. It wasn't bad. It was what it needed to be to establish that new character. But then there's the Seth Rollins match that was so heavily criticized that it effectively ruined Seth Rollins' run as a babyface. And then he had the rematch with Seth in which he won the belt, but the only positive thing people said about that match was, well, at least he won the belt this time. And then he had a match with Daniel Bryan at Survivor Series that a lot of people don't talk about anymore. And then a very disappointing match with The Miz at TLC. And then he had a great match at the Royal Rumble with Daniel Bryan, but similar to Roman, that one good match might have been the exception that proves the rule, because then he had a match with Goldberg that, again, fans were not pleased with. In the interest of fairness, that was a 2-minute match, so there wasn't much you can do. But again, it's another match that was not well received that's associated with Bray Wyatt's character. And then they have the John Cena match at WrestleMania, which I hesitate to call that a match because as great as that was, it was more so a segment because the actual part where they were wrestling was just really the last 40 seconds. Everything else was just character work and character driven. It was great, but again, I hesitate to call that a match. It was more so a segment. And then Bray had the series of matches with Braun Strowman, which at best were fine, but at worst, again, were very disappointing. Especially the last 2 matches he had with Braun, in which the SummerSlam match, the only thing people were talking about was Roman Reigns, which in all honesty they should have been, but no one was talking about how good the match was because people just didn't think the match was that great. And then the match they had at Payback, again, the main topic of discussion is the Roman Reigns heel turn, which again should be the topic of discussion, but the complete match was an afterthought because a lot of people again were left disappointed. I'm not saying these things because I'm not a fan of these guys. I am. I'm a very big Roman Reigns fan, especially his in-ring work. I think he's very underrated in that regard. I think the Bray Wyatt character is fascinating. And I think he can have really good matches because he has had really good matches as a different character. But when you look at all the matches that Roman Reigns has had in the main event of WrestleMania, and you look at all the matches that Bray Wyatt has had as this current character, for both of them, most of the time, their matches typically end up being disappointing. And I think when you put those two things together, I would be very hesitant to put them in the main event of WrestleMania next year because I think the likelihood of them having a great match is outweighed by the likelihood that they're going to have a very disappointing match. And again, that's not to say that I don't think they can have a great WrestleMania match, but I think there's a risk there. And I think you don't have that risk with the Bayley and the Sasha. Because while some people might argue, well, I don't think Bayley and Sasha can have a WrestleMania quality main event match, they already did! Twice! In my opinion, the NXT TakeOver Brooklyn match they had and the NXT TakeOver Respect match that they had are both WrestleMania quality main event matches that just didn't take place at WrestleMania. Wrestling fans and WWE, for that matter, still talk about the matches they had to this day. There are people that they're assigning to developmental contracts who cite that match as their inspiration for becoming a wrestler. When going online and you search top 10, top 25, top 50, top 100 WWE matches, the Bayley and Sasha Banks matches are usually on those lists. WWE made a list called the top 100 matches to watch before you die, and the Bayley and Sasha Banks match was on that list. Gimme Sport ranked the Iron Woman match in their top 25, and I think the context in which they had these matches are important. Bayley was in NXT and Sasha had just left NXT for the main roster, and NXT is basically their learning school for the wrestlers that WWE signs to learn the WWE style of match. Bayley and Sasha had those matches when they were in the developmental brand. And if you want to bring up the bad matches that Bayley and Sasha have had and say, oh, well, I've seen them had a bad match with this person, that person, I understand that. But also consider this. WWE has only really started taking women's wrestling seriously since 2015. That's only 5 years. There's a building period. Before then, they didn't really make that much of an effort to make sure that the women that they were signing or training ended up becoming competent in-ring workers, competent wrestlers. There's a building period, and that building period takes time. So yeah, while you have great wrestlers like Bayley, Sasha, Charlotte, Becky, Asuka, and a few more, you're also still in this learning and building period for a lot of these new people that you're signing, some of which get called up to the main roster way too early before they're ready and they don't have that much experience. I don't care if you're Daniel Bryan, Kazuchika Okada, Kenny Omega, or any great worker for that matter. If you're being paired up with someone in the ring who has a year, maybe two of experience, and you're tasked with pulling a great match out of them, that's going to be a pretty hard thing to accomplish, considering that you're working with someone who can't keep up with you, and you're going to have to slow it down for them to learn. And that's not bad. That's how it should be. But when you take into consideration that's what Bayley and Sasha have had to have been doing, and the other talented women on their roster, which is working with people who don't have as much experience as them, then yeah, not every match is going to be the greatest match ever. But you have to look at what they are working with. And some of them have actually developed into very competent wrestlers and competent workers, but it wasn't always that way. They were in their learning period, and people like Bayley and Sasha were working with them when they were in their learning period. And let's look at the matches that Bayley and Sasha have with other people when they are paired up with someone who is a competent in-ring worker. Both of them have had great matches with Becky Lynch, Charlotte, Asuka, Ronda Rousey. Those are people who are just as good, if not maybe even better, or maybe just a little bit behind them. But the point is that they are on their level. And when they're paired up with someone like that, they have great matches. Some of those matches have main event Raws, SmackDowns, even pay-per-views. And especially when you look at those matches that I mentioned earlier, when Bayley and Sasha are paired up together, they have amazing matches. Matches that we still talk about to this day. And whether you think those matches are overrated, underrated, or fine, the fact of the matter is that when they are working together, it's something that's memorable. It's something that's impactful. It's something that people still talk about, even years after the fact. Just to summarize the points that I've made, yes, I understand that some people might have the argument of, oh, I can't buy into the women main eventing WrestleMania. From a character standpoint, I don't think Bayley and Sasha are credible enough to be in the WrestleMania main event. Or I don't think that the Bayley and Sasha story is the best possible story you could tell for WrestleMania next year. Or I don't think the match between Bayley and Sasha can be a WrestleMania quality match. But to all of that, I'm going to reiterate all my points. The women have already main evented WrestleMania. Bayley and Sasha have done practically everything a women's wrestler can do on the WWE roster. Every major accomplishment they can achieve, other than a Royal Rumble win, they've achieved it. And if you don't think that's credible, then I have to ask, what would you think is credible? And based off the best possible story for next year, I think they would have the best possible story when you look at all the other stories going around that might be in that position for next year. And even the match quality with other potential matches, I don't think is up to par with what Bayley and Sasha can do, because when Bayley and Sasha are put together, again, they have had WrestleMania quality main event matches. They just weren't at WrestleMania.